belongs to which woman. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So Jacob, on his way from his uncle's place, going to back to his family, he meets up with Esau. He gives him a present because he doesn't want to die, because it's been 14, 15 years, and he's still afraid that his brother's going to kill him, because that's why he ran away. So he splits up what he had in two, gives half of it to his brother, and he keeps half of it. And Esau is appeased of his anger because he missed his brother for 15 years. It's great to see him, great to see his family, not to mention he got a bunch of stuff. We didn't go over chapter 34, but just an overview of chapter 34. It deals with his daughter. They're in a land, and they're in the land of Canaan, and his daughter gets defiled by, what's his name? Shechem? Yeah. You have a man named Hamor and Shechem. Shechem likes blanking. I just read it. Dinah, which is the daughter. Shechem likes Dinah. They do what married people do, but they're not married. And do y'all know what happens in that story? Other than that part. Yeah. Yeah. So Simeon, one of the older brothers, Simeon is, I think, the second oldest. And then you have Levi, which is the third oldest. They convince Shechem and Haman that if they want to have Dinah, that they have to be part of them, and they have to be circumcised. That's a whole process, right? Super painful. They did that, and they deceived them. And while they were still recovering, Simeon and Levi went in and they murdered all the men. Okay, this is important because when we get later into the land, when they're going into the land, they are not given land. Levi, the people of Levi, the Levites are going to be the priests, and Simeon is going to be replaced by one of Joseph's children. Did he? Yeah, I thought Reuben, since what he did at the end of chapter 35, and Simeon, because of what he did here, I thought Reuben and Simeon were replaced by Joseph's children. So there were still 12, but the first two, because of what they did in this chapter, no longer got property. Okay, so that's just a little bit of future insight. If you go through the rest of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, they are not given land because of what they do in this chapter. Consequences, right? Consequences of your actions. So that's what happened in chapter 34. Now we're getting into chapter 35, still dealing with Jacob and his children. When Jacob was on his way to Padan Aram, which is where Laban lived, he was met by God, and he was given the three promises that Isaac gave him. And in that land where he was given those promises, he called Bethel, which was Luz. And now he's on his way back. The promise that was, I think it was in chapter 28, Genesis chapter 28 and verse 10. Now Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. That whole section is going to be where God tells Jacob about the blessings. Jacob in turn is, if God will be with me, this is going to be verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, which he does, right? Esau's no longer angry. He gets to Isaac. Then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth. So that comes into play in this chapter because he's on his way back. He just got through with dealing with Esau peacefully, right? So he's going to be having peace with his family when he comes back. And now we're going to get into chapter 35. A quick breakdown from what I have for chapter 35 is going to be verses 1 through, if you're taking notes, I'm a strong believer in outlines, knowing where you're going so that you know what's happening and why it correlates with the whole. So chapter 35, verses 1 through 7, Jacob returns to Bethel because of that promise that he made to God. Verses 8 through 15, you have God's blessing on Jacob. Again, just for reference, retelling. 16 through 22, you have the death of Rachel. 23 through 26, you have a recap of the sons of Jacob, because in 16 through 22, the last son is born. So it just gives a recap of all the sons. I don't believe it mentions the daughter. So that section is just going to be the 12 sons. And then 27 through 29, you have Isaac's death. All right, comments, questions, concerns about the recap of Genesis and where we're at? Cool. All right, so let's get into it. Chapter 35, verse 1. Then God said to Jacob, arise and go to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. So this part is alluding to chapter 28, that whole thing we talked about. And Jacob said to his household and to all those who were with him, because in chapter 34, he not only had what he had from Laban, he got more women and children because they just went and killed all the men from Shechem and Hamor, right? So they accumulated more people, more stuff. Put away the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them. And they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, which is Bethel, which is which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. All right, so thinking about God and his provision and his blessings, thinking about God's character, why is this section important? We're thinking about who God is. If you could think of one word to describe God, give me a word. I'm sorry? All? The great I am? Okay, think of the book of Leviticus. Why was the book of Leviticus given? the law, okay? So in the law, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Levites were given to the priest of Aaron, right? Aaron and the priest as servants. But before they can serve God, Leviticus, they had to cleanse themselves. They had to be made pure and holy. Why? Because God is holy. An unholy and unclean people cannot serve and worship a clean and holy God. That's why the book of Leviticus was given to the Jews, to show them how to be cleansed and made holy so that they can worship God properly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. The words mean things. Looking at here, El Bethel, I have a little note here. El Bethel, again, words mean things. The literal meaning is God of the house of God. So you have El, which is God, and then Bethel, which is the house of God. So you have God dwelling in the house of God. Yeah. So we just have, it's important that words mean things, right? My name means something. My wife's name means something. If I call her something different, it's not going to go well, right? God's name means something. Um, so just thinking about the name of God, who He is holy. So when we're looking at verses 1 through 7, why is it important that Jacob tells his people to get rid of other gods? Right? Thinking why it's important to purify themselves before they go worship God. Because an unholy and unclean people cannot serve a clean and holy God. Can anyone think of anywhere else where this occurs in the book of Genesis? Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you go further, right, Mount Sinai, when they're leaving Egypt, the whole purpose of Exodus is to get foreign gods out of God's people, right? A little bit before here, when Jacob got Rachel, Leah, and their two maidservants, when they were leaving Laban, what did Rachel do? Yeah, she took the idols that were in Laban's house. Laban had a whole ordeal that was dealt with in one of the chapters back here. But Jacob is living with a people that do not worship God. They worshiped idols, right? So there's a process that they have to go through to worship God. Getting rid of their idols, cleansing themselves is part of that process. Question, comments, concerns about why they had to cleanse themselves, why they had to get rid of their idols. No. All right. The next section we're going to go through is 8 through 15. Now Deborah, Rachel's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. So the name of the place was Alon Bekuth. Yeah, we'll go with that. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, Your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Also God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you, and to your descendants after I give this land. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Bethel. Right? So this is just recapping some of the blessings that Jacob was given from Isaac and Abraham, talking about the descendant promise, being fruitful and multiplying, the nations being coming from you, kings coming from you. Also talks about the land promise that was given to Abraham. I had something and I lost it. There it is. All right. Jacob and Israel. It's going to be the same person. It's going to be important later on in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. If you don't understand that, Israel is going to be referred to as the nation of Israel, but also Jacob himself. Same time, same passages. It's going to be confusing. Just keep that in mind. Where did Jacob's name change? Okay, in Bethel. Is there anywhere else that his name changed in the book of Genesis? Where his name was changed. This isn't the first time that this was mentioned, Jacob's name changing. When he wrestled with God. That's going to be in chapter 32. In chapter 32, Jacob wrestles with God. He chapter 32, verse 28. And he said, Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. There's a reason why his name was changed, not just some random name change, right? That's important to know, again, because later in the book, Israel is going to be used for himself, but also the nation as a whole. Verses 16 through 22. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when they were but a little distance to go from Ephrath, Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had hard labor. Now it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said to her, Do not fear, you will have this son also. And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath. This is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Then Israel journeyed and pitched a tent beyond the tower of Eder. And it happened when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. All right. So a couple chapters ago, Isaac has a wife, Rebecca. Jacob has a wife, Rachel. I got that confused in class. So we're talking about Rachel, right? Names mean things. Rachel is not Rebecca. Just another emphasis of words meaning things, right? So Rachel is Jacob's wife. the one that he wanted. Um, as they were journeying, so far Rachel has only had one child. Which child is that? Hasn't had Benjamin yet, already had Joseph, right? In this section, she's having Benjamin. Yeah, or Benoni, right? Does anybody know what the word Benoni means? Right? So, in my Bible, I don't know if y'all's Bible has it. Yeah, yeah. So she called him son of my sorrow, or son of my suffering. Right? She was in labor, which is painful. She was also dying, so she's not going to be able to spend time. She's not going to be able to enjoy her child. So that could be why she's in sorrow, right? Um, but Jacob calls him Benjamin, which is son of um, son of so my yeah, it could be son of righteousness, son of the right. Um, my side note here says son of the right hand. Um, what does the right hand represent? Strength, right? Jesus ascends and sits at the right hand of God, right? So it's going to be strength. And who comes from the line of Benjamin? Saul comes from the line of Benjamin, right? The strength that Saul had, Paul, yeah. So whenever we were first collecting these wives for Jacob, it was interesting to point out which sons came from which wife. Which wife did Jacob love more? Rachel. Which sons come from Rachel? Joseph and Benjamin. They are important, but which line does Christ come from? David, right? Judah, which comes from Leah, which isn't the wife that he loved more. I just thought that was an interesting thing to point out. The Levites and the Judah line come from the wife that he did not love the most. I just thought that was interesting. Something cool to point out. Not that he didn't love one of his wives, but that the two main lines of the Old Testament come from the second wife, pretty much. All right, so that's the death of Rachel. So there was two deaths. We have yeah, there was two deaths already. Deborah, which is Rebecca's nurse. I don't know why that was mentioned, but there's the death. We have the death of Rachel, and then later we're going to get to another death. The next section we come to is just an overview of the sons. Verses 23 through 26. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah were Reuben. If you're taking notes, this is probably something good to note, this section here. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, which is Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. All right, why is that section important? Right, we know that no words are useless in the Bible. Why do we just have a list of names? Okay. Okay. Right. So thinking about the account in Matthew, we have, I think it's in Deuteronomy, there's a list of names. The Book of Leviticus, there's a list of names. Why do we have lists of names in the Bible, other than that they mean something? Exactly right. Right. We have a list of names. God gives us a list of names to establish the lineage, right? Abraham birthed Isaac, Isaac birthed Jacob, Jacob birthed Judah, Judah goes on to Jesus, right? It gives us a list of names in Matthew, and it goes backwards from Jesus all the way back to David, right? All the way back to Judah, right? It's important to know that because promises were given that specifically mentioned Christ coming from a certain person, coming from a certain group, right? This list is important because it gives us that lineage. It gives us the start of some of these promises that are going to be later. All right. So that's Jacob's lineage. Again, don't forget the daughter. Daughter was Dinah, not Diana. Dinah, right? So 13 children in all. Um, Before that section, at the end of the last section in verse 22, what happened? No, so in chapter 35, verses 21 and 22, then Israel journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. And it happened when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Right. This is the section I was talking about earlier when Simeon and Levi went and did their atrocity and killed everybody. Reuben also went and did something that is going to get rid of his land that he was going to receive. That just sets up that encounter later. All right, 27 through the rest of the chapter. Then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath. Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, so Isaac breathed his last and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. All right. This chapter has a lot of deaths in it, but now we are coming to Isaac, right? We had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. One of the reasons Jacob went to Bethel and did his whole promise thing, one of the things he said was, if I come back to my father's house in peace. Isaac's death is going to bring together again Jacob and Esau, and they buried him. I just think it's neat to see how birth can bring people together, but also death. It's going to be sad, but it's going to bring them together. Esau doesn't stay away. Jacob doesn't stay away because they might be mad at each other or whatever. But they're going to come together, and they're going to bury their father. 180 years. Right? That's a long time to live. He's seen a lot. But Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. Do we see that phrase anywhere else? You're shaking your head, yeah? Can you think of where? Is that phrase going to be happy, sad? What emotion do we get from that phrase? I'm sorry? His ancestors are not goners. Okay. But thinking about Isaac breathed his last, that's gonna come into effect in, I think, in the New Testament, right, where Abraham's um, not dead but alive. God's not the God of the dead but the living, right? Um, but I think someone is mentioned in that section, and it's not Isaac. Esau. So what comes to my mind is Moses, right? Moses, when he comes to the end of his life, he was not able to enter the promised land because he disobeyed God, and instead of talking to the rock, he hit it, right? His consequence was that he couldn't step foot in the promised land. And then in the New Testament, it talks about Moses and how he was faithful and how he was gathered together with his people. And then it talks about God is the God of the living, not the dead. But this phrase here is going to be a joyous, happy phrase that he's going to be gathered together with his people. I'm blanking on it. It's all right. But his children are going to be there, and he's going to be gathered with his people physically, and then when he passes on, he's going to be gathered with his people spiritually. It's going to be Abraham and the rest of the people who were God followers, right? So this is going to be something joyous. This is going to be something that occurs later in the Old Testament and again come into effect in the New Testament. So just keep your eye out for that. So just a recap for the book of Genesis. We have beginnings, but the book of Genesis is going to focus on blessings. And the main blessing that Genesis is focusing on is the descendant promise. These men have to have wives, right? So they go and get wives. These men have children, and their children have children. And that goes all the way until the end of Genesis when it talks about Moses. Joseph. Talks about Joseph. Yeah. So that is the main focus of Genesis and what we've been going over, keeping the promises in mind so that when you read the rest of the Bible, those promises stick out and you can look back into Genesis and see how those promises were fulfilled. I'm sorry? Yeah, Moses is the beginning of Exodus. Joseph is going to be the end of Genesis. So I appreciate y'all's participation. The comments were all great. Thank y'all.